Every creature has its own wisdom, and from the fox he learned that playing openly achieves neither the useful nor the pleasurable. If he was invited to spread a slander among the domestics so that gradually it would reach the ears of their master, and he enjoyed the favors of a chambermaid, he would promptly say that he would plant the lie at the tavern with the coachman. Or, if the coachman was his companion in debauchery at the tavern, he would affirm with a smile of complicity that he knew how to win the ear of a certain chambermaid. Ignorant of how he acted or how he would act, his master lost a point to him, for Ferrante knew that the man who does not show his cards leaves his adversary in suspense, and that such mystery inspires respect in others. In eliminating his enemies, who at the beginning were pages and grooms, then gentlemen who believed him their peer, he understood that he had to aim obliquely, never directly. Wisdom fights with carefully studied subterfuges and never acts in the predictable fashion. If he hinted at a movement, it was only to deceive. If he dexterously sketched a gesture in the air, he then behaved in a manner that contradicted the displayed intention. He never attacked when his adversary was at the peak of his strength. He made a show, instead, of friendship and respect for him, but only at the moment when the man appeared helpless. Ferrante then led him to the precipice with the air of one rushing to his aid. He lied often but never pointlessly. He knew that to be believed he had to make everyone see that sometimes he told the truth to his own disadvantage, and kept silent when the truth might win him praise. On the other hand, he tried to gain the reputation of a man sincere with his inferiors, so that their words would reach the ears of the powerful. He became convinced that to simulate with one's equals is a fault, but not to simulate with one's superiors is foolhardiness. Still he did not act too frankly, and in any case not always frankly, fearing that others would become aware of his patterns and one day anticipate him. Nor did he exaggerate in his duplicity, lest to be discovered a second time. To become wise he trained himself to tolerate the foolish, and he surrounded himself with them. He was not so imprudent as to attribute to them all his errors, but when the stakes were high, he made sure that beside him there was always a straw man, impelled by vain ambition to be seen always in front, while Ferrante remained in the background, whom not Ferrante but others would then hold responsible for any misdeed. In short, he appeared to do everything that could redound to his credit, but arranged for another hand to do whatever might earn him a grudge. In displaying his own virtues, which we would better call diabolical talents, he knew that a half displayed and a half barely glimpsed are worth more than a whole openly asserted. At times he made ostentation consist of mute eloquence, in a heedless show of his own excellences, and he had the ability never to reveal all of himself at once. As his position gradually rose and he had to measure himself against those of superior station, he became very able in mimicking their gestures and their language, but he did so only before persons of inferior condition whom he had to charm for some illicit end. With his betters he took care to make his ignorance evident, while seeming to admire in them what he already knew. He carried out every unsavory mission that his patrons entrusted to him, but only if the evil he did was not of such dimensions as to inspire their revulsion. If they asked of him crimes too great, he refused, first to prevent their thinking he might one day be capable of doing as much to them, and secondly, if the sin cried to heaven for vengeance, so as not to become the undesired witness of their remorse. In public he openly manifested piety, but valued only betrayed loyalty, tarnished virtue, self-love, ingratitude, contempt of the sacred. He cursed God in his heart and believed the world to be the offspring of chance, while he trusted in a fate prepared to shift its own course to favor those who knew how to bend it to their own account. To cheer his rare moments of repose, he had commerce only with married prostitutes, incontinent widows, shameless maids. But this always in great moderation, as in his machinations. Ferrante sometimes forewent an immediate reward if he felt attracted by another machination, for his villainy never gave him respite. He lived, in short, day by day, like a murderer in motionless ambush behind an arras, where daggers' blades do not glint. He knew that the first rule of success was to await opportunity, but he suffered because opportunity seemed still far off. This grim, stubborn ambition deprived him of all inner peace. As he believed Roberto had usurped the place which was his by right, no success could appease him, and the only form that happiness and well-being could assume in the eyes of his spirit was his brother's misfortune, and the day when he could be its author. Hazy, embattled giants swarmed in his head. For him there was no sea or land or sky that could afford him relief and calm. Everything that had offended him, everything he desired was a source of torment. He never laughed if not in the tavern to urge drink on some unwitting accomplice. But in the secret of his room he examined himself every day in the glass, to see if the way he moved revealed his impatience, if his eye looked too insolent, if his head was inclined more than was proper, if it did not betray hesitation, or if the wrinkles, too deep on his brow, did not make him seem envenomed. When he interrupted these exercises and, weary, laid aside his masks late in the night, he saw himself as he really was. And then Roberto could not refrain from murmuring some verses he had read a few years earlier. In those eyes where sadness dwells and death, flaming light flares murky and bold scarlet. Sidelong glances and averted eyes are comets. The lashes, lamps, wrathful, proud and desperate. While thunder are the moans, and lightning, breath. Inasmuch as no one is perfect, not even in evil, and Ferrante was not totally able to control the excess of his own villainy, he could not avoid making a misstep. Charged by his master to organize the abduction of a chaste maiden of high degree who was betrothed to a noble gentleman, Ferrante began by writing her love letters signed with the name of his employer. Then, when she drew back, he penetrated to her bedchamber and made her the prey of a violent seduction and ravishment. In a single blow he had deceived her, her betrothed, and the man who had ordered the abduction. After the crime was reported, Ferrante's master was found guilty, then killed in a duel with the betrothed. But by this time Ferrante was on his way to France. In a moment of good humor, Roberto caused Ferrante to attempt, on a January night, the crossing of the Pyrenees astride a stolen mule, which must have taken the vows of some order of reformist tertiaries, considering the monkish qualities it evinced, being so wise, sober, abstinent, and of upright life, that to emphasize the mortification of the flesh, clearly visible in the boniness of its ribs, it knelt down at every step and kissed the earth. The steep mountainsides seemed laden with clotted milk or plastered over with whitewash. The few trees not completely buried under the snow looked so white that they seemed to have stripped off their bark and were shaking more because of the cold than because of the wind. The sun was locked inside its palace and dared not even peer out on the balcony. And if it did show its face for an instant, it hid its nose in a cowl of clouds. The few wayfarers encountered on that path seemed so many Monte Oliveto friars in procession singing Laudabus me et super novem Dealbabor. And Ferrante, seeing himself so white, felt transformed into one dusted by the divine baker with the flower of virtue. One night, tufts of cotton fell from heaven, so thick and big that, as someone else once became a pillar of salt, Ferrante suspected he had become a pillar of snow. The owls, bats, grasshoppers, and moths made arabesques around him as if they wanted to catch him. In the end he struck his head against the feet of a hanged man who, swaying from a tree, made of himself a griselle grotesque. But Ferrante, though a romance must be decked out with pleasant descriptions, could not be a figure in a comedy. He had to head for his goal, imagining to his own measure the Paris he was approaching. Whence he yearned. O Paris, boundless gulf in which whales shrink to dolphins, land of sirens, emporium of vanities, garden of satisfactions, maze of intrigues, Nile of courtiers, and ocean of deception. Here, wishing to invent a passage that no author of novels had yet conceived, to portray the feelings of that greedy youth preparing to conquer the city that was a compendium of Europe's civility, Asia's profusion, Africa's extravagance, and America's riches, where novelty had its realm, deceit its palace, luxury its center, courage its arena, beauty its hemicycle, fashion its cradle, and virtue its grave, Roberto put into Ferrante's mouth an arrogant cry. Paris, a new stir. From Gascony to Poitou, beyond the Lie de France, Ferrante had occasion to carry out a few bold strokes that allowed him to transfer a modest capital from the pockets of some gulls into his own, and thus he arrived at the capital in the garb of a young gentleman, reserved and pleasant, Signor del Pozo. Since no news had reached there of his knaveries in Madrid, he presented himself to some Spaniards close to the Queen, who immediately appreciated his ability to render discreet services for a sovereign who, while faithful to her husband and apparently respectful of the cardinal, maintained relations with the enemy court. His reputation as a reliable executant reached the ears of Richelieu, who, a profound scholar of the human spirit, decided that a man without scruples who served the Queen and was notoriously short of money, if offered a richer reward, would serve him, and he began employing Ferrante, so secretly that not even the cardinal's intimates were aware of that young agent's existence. Apart from his long practice in Madrid, Ferrante had the rare gift of learning languages easily and imitating accents. It was not his habit to boast of his talents, but one day when Richelieu received, in his presence, an English spy, Ferrante demonstrated that he could converse with the traitor. Whereupon Richelieu, in one of the most difficult moments in the relations between France and England, sent the youth to London, where he was to pretend he was a Maltese merchant while gathering information about the movement of ships in the ports. Now Ferrante had made a part of his dream come true. He was a spy, no longer in the pay of just any gentleman but of a biblical leviathan whose arms extended everywhere. Espionage. Roberto was shocked and terrified. The most contagious plague of courts, harpy that swoops down on the royal table with rouged face and hooked claws, flying on bat wings and listening with ears endowed with great tympana, an owl that sees only in the dark, a viper among roses, cockroach on flowers converting into venom the juice it sips at its sweetest, spider of antechambers weaving the strands of its subtle talk to catch every passing fly, parrot with curved beak reporting everything it hears, transforming truth into falsehood and falsehood into truth, chameleon that receives every color and dresses in all save the one that is its true garb. All qualities of which anyone would be ashamed, save the one who by divine, or infernal, decree is born to the service of evil. But Ferrante was not content simply to be a spy and have in his power those whose thoughts he reported. He wanted to be, as they said at that time, a double spy, who like the monster of legend could walk in two opposing directions. If the arena where the powers contend can be a maze of intrigues, who in that maze is the Minotaur who represents the union of both combatant natures? The double spy. If the field on which the battle between courts is played out can be called an inferno wherein the bed of ingratitude flows with rapid flood the phlegathon of oblivion, and where the murky water of passion boils, who is the three-throated Cerberus who barks after discovering and sniffing those who enter there to be torn apart? The double spy. Once arrived in England, while spying for Richelieu, Ferrante decided to enrich himself by also doing the English some service. Wresting information from hirelings and petty functionaries over great mugs of beer in rooms smoky with mud and grease, he introduced himself into ecclesiastical circles as a Spanish priest determined to abandon the Roman Church, whose foul deeds he could bear no longer. Music to the ears of the antipapists eager for any opportunity to document the turpitude of the Catholic clergy. And there was no need even for Ferrante to confess what he did not know. The English already had in their hands the anonymous confession, presumed or real, of another priest. Ferrante then confirmed that document, signing it with the name of a coadjutor to the Bishop of Madrid, who had once treated him with scorn, for which he swore vengeance. When he received from the English the assignment to return to Spain to gather further declarations from priests prepared to slander the Holy See, Ferrante encountered in a tavern of the port a Genoese traveler. Gaining his confidence, he soon discovered that the man was actually one Mahmud, a renegade who in the East had embraced the faith of the Mohammedans, but, disguised as a Portuguese merchant, was collecting information about the English navy, while other spies in the hire of the Sublime Porte were doing the same in France. Ferrante avowed that he had worked for Turkish agents in Italy and had embraced the same religion, assuming the name of Cennet Oglu. He immediately sold his new acquaintance his news of movements in the English ports, and was given a sum to take a message to Mahmud's brothers in France. The English ecclesiastics believed he had already set out for Spain, but he was unwilling to reject a chance to earn more from his stay in England. So, getting in touch with men of the Admiralty, he described himself as a Venetian, Messer Scampi, a name he invented, recalling Captain Gambero, who had performed secret duties for the Council of that republic, with particular reference to the plans of the French merchant marine. Now, banished as a consequence of a duel, he had to seek refuge in a friendly country. To show his good faith, he was able to inform his new masters that France had obtained information on the English ports through Mahmud, a Turkish spy now living in London disguised as a Portuguese. In the possession of Mahmud, promptly arrested, notes on the English ports were duly discovered, and thus Ferrante, or rather, Scampi, was judged reliable. Promised a situation in England and blessed with a good initial sum, he was sent to France to join other English agents there. On arriving in Paris, he immediately passed on to Richelieu some of the information the English had taken from Mahmud. Then he found the friends whose addresses the Genoese renegade had given him, and he presented himself as Charles de la Brèche, a former monk who had gone over to the service of the Crescent and had just arranged in London a plot to cast discredit on the whole breed of Christians. Those agents gave him credence, because they had already learned of a pamphlet in which the Anglican Church had published the malefactions of a Spanish priest, and in Madrid, when the news reached there, they arrested the prelate to whom Ferrante had attributed his treason, and now the man was awaiting death in the dungeons of the Inquisition. Ferrante persuaded the Turkish agents to confide in him the information they had gathered about France, and he sent it straightway to the English Admiralty, receiving further payment. Then he returned to Richelieu and revealed to him the existence in Paris of a Turkish plot. Once again Richelieu admired Ferrante's skill and loyalty, and he invited him to undertake a task still more arduous. For some time the cardinal had been concerned about activities in the salon of the Marquise de Rambouillet, and he had been seized by the suspicion that among those free spirits there was murmuring against him. He first made the mistake of sending to La Rambouillet a faithful courtier of his, who foolishly made inquiries about possible sedition. Arthenis replied that her guests were so familiar with her regard for his eminence that even if they had misgivings about him, they would never dare speak anything but the greatest good of him in her presence. Richelieu now planned to have a foreigner appear in Paris, one who could gain admittance to those consistories. Now, Roberto had no desire to invent all the cabals by which Ferrante achieved an introduction to that salon, but he found it proper to have him arrive there forearmed with some recommendation, and in disguise. A wig and a white beard, a face aged with pomades and tinctures, a black patch over the left eye, and voila, the Abbé de Morphy. Roberto could not think that Ferrante, in every way similar to him, had been at his side on those now distant evenings, but he remembered seeing an elderly abbé with a black patch on his eye, and he decided that the old man must have been Ferrante. So in that world, and after 10 or more years, he had found Roberto again. It is impossible to express the joyous rancor with which the deceiver rediscovered his hated brother. With a face that would have seemed transfigured and overwhelmed by malevolence had it not been hidden beneath his disguise, Ferrante told himself that at last he had the opportunity to annihilate Roberto, and to take possession of his name and his wealth. First, he spied on him, for weeks and weeks in the course of those evenings, studying that face to catch in it the trace of every thought. Accustomed as he was to concealing, he was also very skilled at discovering. For that matter, love cannot be hidden. Like any fire, it is revealed by smoke. Following Roberto's glances, Ferrante immediately understood that he loved the lady. He then told himself that his first step would be to take from Roberto what he held most dear. Ferrante noticed that Roberto, after attracting the attention of the lady with his talk, lacked the courage to approach her. His brother's shyness served the spy's purposes. The lady could easily interpret it as indifference, and to scorn affection is the most effective way to extinguish it. Roberto was clearing the path for Ferrante. Ferrante allowed the lady to suffer in uncertain expectation, then, calculating the right moment, he set himself to flatter her. But could Roberto allow Ferrante a love equal to his own? Certainly not. Ferrante considered woman the portrait of inconstancy, minister of fraud, fickle in speech, belated in action, and quick in caprice. Educated by would-be ascetics who never ceased reminding him that el hombre es el fuego, la mujer la estopa, viene el diablo y sopla, he was accustomed to considering every daughter of Eve an imperfect animal, an error of nature, a torture for the eyes if ugly, a suffering of the heart if beautiful, tyrant of any who loved her, enemy of any who scorned her, disordered in her desires, implacable in her dislikes, capable of enchanting with the mouth and enchaining with the eyes. But it was this very disdain that impelled him to entrap. From his lips came words of adulation, but in his heart he was celebrating the degradation of his victim. Ferrante was thus preparing to lay his hands on that body that Roberto had not dared graze with his thoughts. Was he, despiser of everything that for Roberto was object of devotion, ready, now, to steal Lilia and make her the insipid ingenue of his comedy? What torture, and what painful duty, to follow the insane logic of romances, which imposes participation in the most odious effects, for you must conceive as the children of your own imagination the most odious of protagonists. But there was nothing to be done. Ferrante would have Lilia, otherwise why create a fiction, if not to die of it? What happened and how, Roberto could not picture, nor was he ever tempted to try. Perhaps Ferrante late one night stole into Lilia's chamber, clinging to some ivy, whose tenacious embrace is a nocturnal invitation to every loving heart that climbed up to her window. There is Lilia, showing signs of outraged virtue, to such a degree that anyone would be convinced of her indignation, anyone except a man like Ferrante, ready to believe the readiness of all human beings to betray. And here is Ferrante, sinking to his knees before her and speaking. What does he say? He says, in a false voice, everything that Roberto would not only have liked to say to her but has said, without her knowing that he said it. How can the villain have managed, Roberto asked himself, to learn the tenor of the letters I sent her? And further, of the letters Saint Savin dictated to me at Casali, which I later destroyed. And even the letters I am writing now, on this ship. And yet there is no doubt, Ferrante is declaiming in sincere tones sentences Roberto knew very well. My lady, in the wondrous architecture of the universe it has been written since the first day of creation that I would encounter you and love you. Forgive the raving of a desperate man, or, better, pay no heed to it. It was never said that sovereigns had to justify the death of their slaves. Have you not made of my eyes 2 alembics, the better to distill my life and convert it into limpid water? I beseech you, do not turn your lovely head away. Bereft of your gaze, I am blind, for you do not see me. Deprived of your word, I am mute, for you do not speak to me, and I shall be without memory if you do not remember me. Oh, let love at least make of me an insensible shard, a mandrake, a fountain of stone that weeps away every anguish. The lady now surely trembled, in her eyes burned all the love she had formerly concealed, burned with the strength of a prisoner whose bars of reserve someone has broken, offering the silken ladder of opportunity. Ferrante had only to press on, and he did not confine himself to saying what Roberto had written. He knew other words that he now poured into the ears of the bewitched lady, bewitching also Roberto, who could not recall having written them. O my pale sun, at your sweet pallor the vermilion dawn loses all its fire. O sweet eyes, of you I ask only to be ill. And in vain do I flee through fields or woods to forget you. No forest covers the earth, no tree rises in a forest, no bough grows on a tree, no frond sprouts from a bough. No flower laughs in the frond, no fruit is born from the flower, in which I do not see your smile. And, at her first blush, oh, Lilia, if you knew. I have loved you without knowing your face or your name. I sought you, and I did not know where you were. But one day you appeared to me like an angel. Oh, I know, you are wondering why this love of mine does not remain pure in silence, chaste in distance. But I am dying, oh my heart, now you see my soul is already escaping me, do not allow it to dissolve in the air, grant that it may dwell on your lips. Ferrante's accents were so sincere that Roberto himself now wanted her to fall into that sweet lime. Only thus could he have the certainty that she loved him, Roberto. So Lilia bent to kiss him, then did not dare. Willing and unwilling, 3 times she held her lips to the desired breath, 3 times she drew back, then cried. Oh yes, yes, if you do not ensnare me, I shall never be free, I will not be chaste if you do not violate me. And, taking his hand, and kissing it, she raised it to her bosom. Then she drew him to her, tenderly stealing the breath from his lips. Ferrante leaned over that urn of happiness, to which Roberto had entrusted the ashes of his heart, and the 2 bodies melted into a single soul, the 2 souls into a single body. Roberto no longer knew who was in those arms, since she believed she was in his, and he, in yielding her mouth to Ferrante, tried to withdraw his own, so as not to concede that kiss to the other. Thus, while Ferrante kissed, and she kissed in return, the kiss now dissolved into nothing, and Roberto was left only with the knowledge of having been robbed of everything. But he could not avoid thinking of what he refused to imagine, for he knew that it is in the nature of love to exceed. At that outraged excess, forgetting that she was giving to Ferrante, believing him Roberto, the proof that Roberto had so desired, he hated Lilia, and running about the ship, he howled, "Oh, wretch! I would offend all your sex if I called you woman. What you have done is more proper to a fury than to a female, and even the title of beast would be too great an honor for such an animal of hell. You are worse than the asp that poisoned Cleopatra, worse than the horned viper whose deceits delight the birds then sacrificed its hunger, worse than the amphisbaena that, on anyone it grasps, scatters such venom that in an instant he dies, worse than the dreadleps that, armed with 4 venomous teeth, corrupts the flesh it bites, worse than the jacule that darts from trees and strangles its victim, worse than the colubra that vomits its poison into fountains, worse than the basilisk that kills with his gaze. Infernal termagant, who knows neither heaven nor earth, neither sex nor faith, monster begot of a stone, an alp, an oak. Then he stopped, realized again that she had yielded to Ferrandi, believing him Roberto, and that therefore she was not to be damned before given for that subterfuge. Careful, my beloved, he presents himself to you with my face, knowing that you could love no one who was not I. What am I to do now, except hate myself to be able to hate him? Can I allow you to be betrayed, enjoying his embrace, believing it mine? I have already accepted life in this prison to pass all my days and my nights devoted to the thought of you. Can I now permit you to believe you are bewitching me while in fact succumbing to his spell? Oh, love, 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 have you not punished me enough already? Is this not a death undying? Chapter 30. Anatomy of erotic melancholy. For 2 days Roberto again fled the light of day. In his sleep he saw only the dead. His mouth and gums were irritated. From his viscera the pain spread to his chest, then to his back, and he vomited acid substances, though he had taken no food. The black bile, gnawing and undermining his whole body, fermented and erupted in bubbles such as those water expels when subjected to intense heat. He had surely fallen victim, and it is inconceivable that he realized this only then, to what is generally called erotic melancholy. Had he not been led to explain, that evening at Arthenesis, how the image of the beloved awakes love, insinuating itself as simulacrum through the meatus of the eyes, those doorkeepers and spies of the soul? But afterwards the amorous impression allows itself to glide slowly through the veins until it reaches the liver, stimulating concupiscence, which moves the whole body to sedition, leads straight to the conquest of the citadel of the heart, whence it attacks the more noble powers of the brain and enslaves them. Which is to say that its victims virtually lose their reason, the senses stray, the intellect is beclouded, the imagination is depraved, and the poor lover grows thin, wan, his eyes become hollow, he sighs, and is steeped in jealousy. How is it to be cured? Roberto thought he knew the remedy above all remedies, which, however, was denied him, to possess the beloved person. He did not know that this is not enough, for melancholics do not become such through love, rather, they fall in love to express their melancholy, preferring desolate places for spiritual converse with the absent beloved, thinking only of how to arrive in her presence, although, arriving there, they become all the more afflicted, and would like still to attain some other goal. Roberto tried to recall what he had heard from men of science who had studied erotic melancholy. Apparently it was caused by idleness, by sleeping supine, and by an excessive retention of seed. For too many days he had lived in enforced idleness, but as far as retention of seed was concerned, he shunned any enquiry into its causes or any thought of remedy. He had heard talk about hunting parties as a stimulus of oblivion, and decided he would intensify his natatory endeavors, and would not sleep on his back, but among the substances that excite the senses is salt, and in swimming one swallows a fair amount of salt. Further, he remembered having heard that the Africans, exposed to the sun, were more addicted to vice than the Hyperboreans. Was it perhaps food that had unleashed his Saturnalian propensities? Doctors forbade game, goose liver, pistachios, truffles, and ginger, but they did not say which fish were not advisable. They warned against overly comfortable clothing, such as sable and velvet, and also against music, amber, nutmeg, and cypress powder. But what could he know of the unknown power of the 100 perfumes released from the greenhouse below, or of those borne by the winds from the island? He could have warded off many of these unfortunate influences with camphor, borage, wood sorrel, with enemas, with a vomitory of salt of vitriol dissolved in broth, and finally with leeching of the median vein of the arm or that of the brow, and then by eating only chicory, endive, lettuce, and melons, grapes, cherries, plums, and pears and, above all, fresh mint. But none of these were at hand on the Daphne. He resumed moving among the waves, trying not to swallow too much salt, and resting as seldom as possible. Certainly he did not cease thinking about the story he had summoned up, but his irritation with Ferrandi was now translated into fits of arrogance, and he measured himself against the sea as if, subjecting it to his will, he were making his enemy his subject. After a few days, one afternoon he remarked for the first time the amber color of the hair on his chest and, as he notes with various rhetorical contortions, his groin. He realized that his whole body had become tanned, also strengthened, for on his arms he saw a rippling of muscles he had never noticed before. He considered himself a Hercules at this point, and he lost all sense of prudence. The next day he descended into the water without the rope. He would abandon the ladder, moving along the hull to the right as far as the rudder, then he would round the stern, and swim back along the other side, passing beneath the bowsprit. And he put his arms and legs to work. The sea was not calm, and wavelets flung him against the ship's side, forcing him to redouble his efforts, whether to stay close to the ship or to move away from it. He was breathing heavily, but he advanced without fear, until he reached his halfway point, the stern. He realized that he had expended all his strength. He was now too weak to swim the length of the ship, but he could not turn back either. He tried clinging to the rudder, which offered him only a dubious hold, covered as it was with mucilage, while it slowly creaked under the alternating slaps of the waves. Above his head he could see the gallery, imagining beyond its windows the safe haven of his quarters. He told himself that if by misadventure the ladder at the prow had come loose, he might spend hours and hours before his death yearning for that deck he had so often wished to leave. The sun was covered by a patch of clouds, and he was already growing numb. He stretched his head back, as if to sleep. After a moment he opened his eyes, turned, and realized that what he had feared was happening. The waves were pulling him away from the ship. He made an effort and swam back to the side, touching it as if to derive strength. Above his head he glimpsed a cannon that protruded from a gunport. If he had his rope, he thought, he could make a noose, throw it up, and catch by the throat that mouth of fire, then hoist himself, holding the rope with his arms and pressing his feet against the hull. But the rope was absent, and worse still, he lacked the spirit and the strength to scale such a height. It made no sense to die like this, beside his refuge. He came to a decision. Now, doubling the stern, whether he turned back along the right side or continued along the left, the distance between him and the ladder was the same. As if casting lots, he resolved to swim to the left, taking care that the current did not separate him from the Daphne. He swam, clenching his teeth, his muscles strained, not daring to let himself relax, fiercely determined to survive, even, he said, if he died in the attempt. With a jubilant cry he reached the bowsprit, clung to the prow, then came to the Jacob's ladder. Praise Jacob, and may all the holy patriarchs of the sacred scriptures be blessed by the Lord God of hosts. His strength was gone. He remained clinging to the ladder for perhaps half an hour. But in the end he managed to pull himself up to the deck, where he tried to add up the sum of his experience. First, he could swim, enough to go from one end of the ship to the other and back. Second, an exploit of this kind took him to the extreme limit of his physical possibilities. Third, since the distance between ship and shore, even at low tide, was many, many times greater than the entire perimeter of the Daphne, he could not hope to swim long enough to be able finally to grasp something solid. Fourth, the low tide did indeed bring terra firma closer, but with its reflux it made his progress more difficult. Fifth, if by chance he reached the halfway point and lacked the strength to go forward, he would not be able to return either. Therefore he had to continue with the rope, and for a much longer time. He would go east as far as his strength allowed, and then he would tow himself back. Only exercising like this, day after day, would he be able to venture farther on his own. He chose a calm afternoon, when the sun was behind him. He fitted himself out with a very long rope, one end fixed tightly to the mainmast. It lay on the deck in many coils, ready to play out gradually. He swam calmly, not tiring himself too much, resting often. He looked at the beach and the two promontories. Only now, from below, did he realize how far he was from that ideal line which extended from one cape to the other, from south to north, beyond which he would enter the day before. Having failed to understand Father Casper properly, he was convinced that the coral barrier began only at the point where little white waves marked the first reefs. Whereas obviously the coral began earlier. Otherwise the Daphne would have anchored closer to land. So his bare legs scraped against something below the surface. Almost at the same time his eye caught an underwater movement of colored forms, and he felt an unbearable stinging at his thigh and shin. It was as if he had been bitten or clawed. To get away from that reef he pushed with a heel, wounding a foot also in this act. He seized the rope, tugging on it so hard that when he was back on board, he saw his hands were excoriated, but he was more concerned about the condition of his leg and foot. There were clusters of painful pustules. He bathed them with fresh water, which soothed the stinging a bit. But towards evening and through the night, the burning was accompanied by an acute itching, and in his sleep he probably scratched himself, so the next morning the pustules oozed blood and white matter. He then had recourse to Father Casper's preparations, spiritus, allia, floris, which calmed the infection to some degree, but for a whole day he still felt the instinctive impulse to claw at those buboes. Once again he calculated the sum of his experience, and came to 4 conclusions. The reef was closer than the reflux suggested, which encouraged him to try the venture again. Some creatures living on it, crabs, fish, perhaps the corals, or some sharp stones, had the power to infect him with some kind of pestilence. If he wanted to return to those stones, he had to be shod and clothed, which would make his movements more awkward. In any case, since he could not shield his whole body, he had to be able to see underwater. This last conclusion made him recall that persona vitriae mask for seeing underwater that Father Casper had shown him. He tried fastening it at his nape, and discovered that it enclosed his face, allowing him to look out as if through a window. He tried breathing, and realized that a bit of air came in. If air entered, then water would enter as well. So while using it, he would have to hold his breath. The more air remained in it, the less water would enter, and he would return to the surface as soon as the mask had filled. It would not be an easy operation, and Roberto spent 3 days testing all its phases in the water, but close to the Daphne. Near the Salus Piluses he found a pair of canvas hose that protected his feet without weighting him too much, and a pair of trousers to be tied at the calf. It took him half a day to relearn those movements that had now become so easy for him when he was naked. Then he swam with the mask. In deep water he could not see much, though he did glimpse a school of gilded fish passing many ells below him, as if they were navigating in a tub. 3 days, we said. In the course of those days Roberto first learned to look below him while holding his breath, then to move as he looked, then to remove the mask while he was in the water. In this enterprise, instinctively, he also learned a new position, which consisted of filling and swelling his chest, kicking as if he were walking in haste, while he thrust his chin upwards. But it was more difficult, maintaining the same equilibrium, to put the mask back on and fasten it at his nape. He promptly reminded himself, further, that once at the reef, if he assumed that vertical position, he would strike the rocks. If on the other hand he kept his face out of the water, he would not see what he was kicking. Hence he considered it would be better not to fasten the mask but instead press it with both hands and hold it over his face. Which, however, obliged him to proceed moving only his legs, while keeping them outstretched horizontally to avoid striking anything below, an action he had never tried, and which required long practice before he could execute it confidently. In the course of these experiments he transformed every fit of rage into a new chapter of his romance of Ferrante. And he caused his story to take a more spiteful turn, as Ferrante was duly punished. Chapter 31. A breviary for politicals. In any case he could not delay resuming his story. It is true that poets, after having spoken of a memorable event, neglect it for a while in order to keep the reader in suspense, and in this skill we recognize also the well-planned novel. But the theme must not be abandoned for too long, so the reader should not become lost among too many other, parallel actions. So it was time to return to Ferrante. Stealing Lilia from Roberto was only one of the goals Ferrante had set for himself. The other was to cause Roberto to fall into disfavor with the cardinal. Not easy to achieve. The cardinal did not even know of Roberto's existence. But Ferrante knew how to make the most of opportunities. One day Richelieu was reading a letter in his presence, and said to him, "Cardinal Mazarin tells me a story about the English and a certain powder of sympathy they have. Did you hear any talk of it in London? What is it, your eminence? Signor Pozzo, or whatever your name is, learn that you must never answer a question with another question, especially if it is asked by someone of a station higher than your own. If I knew what it was, I would not ask you about it. In any event, if you know nothing of this powder, have you heard any mention of a new secret method for determining longitudes? I confess I know nothing on this subject. If your eminence would enlighten me, perhaps Signor Pozzo, you would be amusing if you were not insolent. I would not be the master of this country if I were to enlighten others about things they do not know, unless those others were the King of France, which does not seem to be your case. So do only what you know how to do. Keep your ears open and learn things of which before you knew nothing. Then you will come and report them to me, and afterwards you will take care to forget them. That is what I have always done, your eminence. Or at least I think so, for I have forgotten doing it. Now that is to my liking. You may go." Some time later came that memorable evening when Ferrante heard Roberto expound the theory of the powder. He could hardly believe his luck, able to draw to Richelieu's attention an Italian gentleman who consorted with the Englishman Digby, notoriously connected, some time ago, with the Duc de Boucancan, and who seemed to know a great deal about the powder. At the moment when he began casting discredit on Roberto, Ferrante still had to arrange how to take his place. So he revealed to the cardinal that he, Ferrante, passed himself off as Signor del Pozzo because his job as informer obliged him to remain incognito, but in reality he was the true Roberto de la Greve, a valorous fighter with the French during the siege of Casale. The other man, who so slyly talked about the English powder, was a rascal adventurer. Exploiting a vague physical resemblance, under the name of Mahmoud the Arab, he had recently served as a spy in London taking orders from the Turks. Thus Ferrante prepared for the moment when, having ruined his brother, he could assume his identity, becoming the one and true Roberto not only to the relatives still left de la Greve but in the eyes of all Paris, as if the other had never existed. In the meantime, as he masked himself with Roberto's face to conquer Lilia, Ferrante learned, like everyone else, of the misfortune of Cinq-Mars, and risking a great deal surely, but ready to give his life to consummate his revenge, again in the guise of Roberto he made a show of belonging to the company of that conspirator's friends. Then he whispered to the cardinal that the false Roberto de la Greve, who knew so much about a secret dear to the English, was clearly conspiring, and Ferrante promptly produced witnesses who could declare they had seen Roberto with this or that man. As is clear, a castle of lies and travesties lay behind the trap into which Roberto had fallen. But Roberto had fallen for reasons and in ways unknown to Ferrante himself, whose plans were then upset by the death of Richelieu. What, in fact, had happened? Richelieu, highly suspicious, was using Ferrante without mentioning him to anyone, not even to Mazarin, whom he obviously distrusted, seeing him by now poised like a vulture over an ailing body. Still, as his disease progressed, Richelieu did pass some information to Mazarin, without revealing its source. "By the way, my good Jules. Yes, Eminence and my beloved father. Keep an eye on one Roberto de la Greve. He goes in the evening to Madame de Rambouillet. It seems he knows a great deal about her powder of sympathy. And, further, according to an informer of mine, the young man also frequents a circle of conspirators. You must not tire yourself, Eminence. I will deal with everything." And so Mazarin initiated, on his own, an enquiry into Roberto, until he had learned the little he made a great show of knowing on the night of the arrest. But in all of this he knew nothing of Ferrante. Meanwhile Richelieu was dying. What would happen to Ferrante? Richelieu dead, Ferrante was without protection. He had to establish some contact with Mazarin, for a scoundrel is an evil heliotrope turning always in the direction of the most powerful. But he cannot go to the new minister without bringing some evidence of his worth. He finds no further trace of Roberto. Can Roberto be ill? Has he set off on a journey? Ferrante thinks of everything save the possibility that his slanders have had their effect and Roberto has been arrested. Ferrante does not dare show himself publicly in the guise of Roberto, for fear of arousing the suspicions of those who know that La Greve is far away. Whatever may have happened between him and Lilia, Ferranti ceases all communication with her, impassive as a man aware that every victory costs much time. He knows, also, he should make use of distance. The finest qualities lose their glow if displayed too often, and fancy travels farther than sight. Even the phoenix resorts to distant habitats to keep its legend alive. But time is pressing. On Roberto's return, Mazarin must already suspect him and want him dead. Ferranti consults his peers at court, and discovers that Mazarin can be approached through the young Colbert, to whom he sends a letter hinting at an English threat in the matter of longitudes, knowing nothing about them, and having heard them mentioned only once, by Richelieu. In exchange for his revelations he asks for a considerable sum, and is granted a meeting, at which he appears dressed as an elderly abbé with a black eye patch. Colbert is not ingenuous. This abbé's voice sounds familiar, the few things he says have a dubious ring. Colbert summons 2 guards, goes to the visitor, tears off the patch and the beard, and whom does he find before him? The same Roberto de la Greve he himself consigned to his agents, charging them to put this Italian on board Dr. Bird's ship. In telling himself this story, Roberto exults. Ferranti has walked straight into the trap, all on his own. You, San Patrizio? Colbert promptly cried. Then, seeing Ferranti start and remain silent, he ordered the man flung into a dungeon. It was a great joke for Roberto to imagine the colloquy between Mazarin and Colbert, who immediately informed the cardinal. The man must be mad, your eminence. To dare evade his mission, I can understand, but to try to come here to sell us what we had already given him can only be evidence of madness. Colbert, no one could be so mad as to take me for a fool. So our man is playing a game, convinced that he holds winning cards. In what sense? For example, suppose he boarded that ship and immediately discovered what he was to have learned, so he no longer needed to stay there. But if he had wanted to betray us, he would have gone to the Spanish or to the Dutch. He would not have come here to challenge us. And to ask what of us, after all? Money? He knew quite well that if he acted loyally, he could have had even a place at court. Obviously he is convinced he has discovered a secret worth more than a place at court. Believe me, he knows men. We can only lead him on. I will see him this evening. Mazarin received Ferranti while with his own hands he was putting the final touches to a table he had laid for his guests, a triumph of things that seemed to be other things. On the board, wicks glowed, protruding from goblets of ice, and bottles in which the wine was of unexpected colors stood among baskets of lettuces garlanded with artificial flowers and fruits artificially aromatic. Mazarin, who believed that Roberto, that is to say Ferranti, was in possession of a secret from which he wanted to derive great profit, had determined to make a show of knowing everything, in short, that he did not know, to induce the rogue to let some hint escape him. On the other hand, Ferranti, when he found himself in the cardinal's presence, had already guessed that Roberto was in possession of a secret from which great profit could be derived, and he had determined to make a show of knowing everything, in short, that he did not know, to induce the cardinal to let some hint escape him. Thus we have on stage 2 men, each of whom knows nothing of what he believes the other knows, and to deceive each other reciprocally both speak in illusions, each of the 2 hoping, in vain, that the other holds the key to this puzzle. What a beautiful story, Roberto said to himself as he sought the thread of the skein that he had twisted. Signor di San Patrizio, Mazarin said as he moved a dish of live crayfish that seemed cooked closer to another dish of cooked crayfish that seemed alive. A week ago we put you on board the Amaryllis in Amsterdam. You cannot have abandoned your mission. You were well aware you would pay for that with your life. Therefore you must have already discovered what you were sent to discover. Ferranti, confronted with this dilemma, saw that it was not in his interest to confess having abandoned the mission. So there was only one course open to him. If it please your eminence, he said, in a sense I have learned what your eminence wanted me to learn, and he added to himself, and meanwhile I have learned that the secret is on board a ship named the Amaryllis, and that it sailed from Amsterdam a week ago. Come, sir, do not be modest. I know very well that you now know more than I was expecting. After your departure I received other information, for you surely do not imagine you are the only agent I have. Thus I know that what you have found is of great value, and I am not here to haggle. I cannot help wondering, however, why you chose to come back to me in such a tortuous way. And at the same time he indicated to the servants where they should set some meats in wooden forms shaped like fish, on which he had them pour not broth but julep. Ferranti was more and more convinced that the secret was priceless, but he told himself it is easy to kill a bird in flight if it flies in a straight line, but not if it constantly changes direction. Therefore he took his time, sounding out the adversary. Your eminence knows the prize at stake required tortuous means. Ah, you rascal, Mazarin said to himself, you are not sure what your discovery is worth and you are waiting for me to set the price. But you must be the one to speak first. To the center of the table he shifted some sorbets so confected that they seemed peaches still clinging to their bough. Then he spoke. I know what you have. You know that you can bring it only to me. Do you think it a good idea to pass white off as black and black as white? Ah, you damned fox, Ferranti muttered under his breath, you do not in the least know what I should know, and the trouble is that I do not know it either. Then he also spoke. Your eminence knows well that sometimes the truth can have the essence of bitterness. Knowledge never harms, but sometimes it hurts. Hurt me, then. I will not be more hurt than when I learned you had stained your honor with treason. I should have left you in the hands of the executioner. Ferranti finally realized that in playing the part of Roberto, he risked ending on the gallows. Better to reveal himself for what he was, and risk at most a beating from a lackey. Your Eminence, he said, I have made the mistake of not telling you the truth at once. Monsieur Colbert took me for Roberto de la Greve, and his error has perhaps also misled even a gaze as acute as that of your Eminence. But I am not Roberto, I am only his natural brother, Ferranti. I presented myself to offer some information I thought would interest your Eminence, since your Eminence was the first to mention to the late and never to be forgotten Cardinal the plot of the English, as your Eminence knows. The powder of sympathy and the problem of longitude. At these words Mazarin made a gesture of pique, almost knocking over a tureen of fake gold decorated with jewels exquisitely simulated in glass. He blamed a servant, then murmured to Colbert, put this man back where he was. It is quite true that the gods blind those they wish to destroy. Ferranti thought to arouse interest by revealing that he knew the most private secrets of the late cardinal, and exaggerating in his sycophantic pride, he tried to show himself better informed than his deceased master. But no one had yet told Mazarin, and it would have been difficult to prove it to him, that there had been commerce between Ferranti and Richelieu. Mazarin found himself facing someone, whether Roberto or another, who not only knew what he had said to Roberto but also what he had written to Richelieu. From whom had he learned this? When Ferranti was led away, Colbert said, Does your Eminence believe what that man said? If he were a twin, all would be explained. Roberto would still be at sea, and... No, if this man is Roberto's brother, the case is even more inexplicable. How has he come to know what was known first only to me, you, and our English informer, and then to Roberto de la Greve? His brother must have told him. No, his brother learned everything from us only that evening, and afterwards he was never out of someone's sight, until the ship set sail. No, this man knows too many things he should not know. What shall we do with him? Interesting question, Colbert. If he is Roberto, he knows what he has seen on that ship and he must speak. If he is not, we must absolutely discover where he obtained his information. In either case, excluding the very thought of hailing him before a judge, where he would say too much and in the presence of too many people, we cannot simply make him disappear with a few inches of steel in his back. He still has much to tell us. If he is not Roberto but, as he says, Ferrand or Fernand. Ferranti, I believe. No matter. If he is not Roberto, who is behind him? Not even the Bastille is a secure place. People are known to have sent messages from there and received them. We must wait till he speaks, and find a way to open his mouth, but in the meantime we should shut him up somewhere unknown to all, and make sure no one finds out who he is. And it was at this point that Colbert had a darkly luminous idea. A few days before, a French vessel had captured a pirate ship off the coast of Brittany. It was, by strange coincidence, a Dutch flute with the name, naturally unpronounceable, of Tweed Daphne, that is to say, Daphne II, a sign, Mazarin remarked, that somewhere there must be a Daphne I, which showed how those Protestants lacked not only faith but also imagination. The crew was made up of people of every race. The only thing to do was hang them all, but it was worth investigating whether or not they were in the hire of England and from whom they had seized the ship, which might then be advantageously bartered with its legitimate owners. So it was decided to moor the ship not far from the Seine estuary, in a little half-hidden bay that escaped the notice even of the pilgrims for Santiago who, coming from Flanders, passed a short distance away. On a tongue of land that enclosed the bay there was an old fortress which had once served as a prison but was now more or less abandoned. And there the pirates were cast into dungeons, guarded by only 3 men. Enough, Mazarin said, take 10 of my guards, put them under the command of a good captain not without prudence. Biscarat. He has always done things well, from the days when he duelled with the musketeers over the cardinal's honor. Perfect. Have the prisoner taken to the fort and put him in the guard-room. Biscarat will eat his meals with the prisoner in that room and accompany him if he is taken out for air. A guard at the door of the room also, at night. Time in confinement weakens even the most stubborn spirit. Our obstinate spy will have only Biscarat to speak to, and he may let some confidence slip. And, above all, no one must recognize him, either during the trip or at the fort. If he goes out for air. Come, Colbert. Where's your inventive spirit? Cover his face. Might I suggest? An iron mask closed with a lock, the key thrown into the sea? Come now, Colbert, are we in the land of romances? Last night we saw those Italian players wearing leather masks with long noses that alter their features yet leave the mouth free. Find one of those, put it on him in such a way that he cannot remove it, and give him a mirror in his cell, so he can die of shame day by day. He chose to mask himself as his brother, did he not? Then let him be masked as Polichinelle. And remember, from here to the fort, a closed carriage, stopping only at night in an open country, no showing himself at the post stations. If anyone asks questions, a lady high degree is being escorted to the frontier, a conspirator against the cardinal. Ferranti, embarrassed by his burlesque disguise, now had been staring for days, through a grating that allowed scant light into his room, at a grey amphitheater surrounded by bleak dunes, with the Tweed Daphne riding at anchor in the bay. He controlled himself when he was in Biscarat's presence, letting the captain believe sometimes he was Roberto, sometimes Ferranti, so that the reports sent to Mazarin were always puzzling. He managed to overhear, in passing, some conversation among the guards, and had learned that in the dungeons of the fort a band of pirates lay in chains. Wanting to take revenge on Roberto for a wrong he had not inflicted, Ferrandi racked his brain for a way to encourage a revolt, to free those rogues, seize the ship, and set out on Roberto's trail. He knew where to begin. In Amsterdam he would find spies who could tell him something of the destination of the Amaryllis. He would overtake it, would discover Roberto's secret, rid himself of that tedious double in the sea, and then he would be able to sell something to the cardinal at a high price. Or perhaps not. Once he discovered the secret, he might decide to sell it to others. But why sell it, indeed? For all he knew, Roberto's secret could involve the map of a treasure island, or else the secret of the Alumbrados and the Rosy Cross, of which people had been talking for 20 years. He would exploit the revelation to his own advantage, would no longer have to spy for a master, would have spies in his own service. Wealth and power gained, not only would he possess the ancient name of his family, but the lady would be his as well. To be sure, Ferrandi, steeped in rancor, was not capable of true love, but, Roberto told himself, there are people who would never have fallen in love if they had not heard love talked about. Perhaps, in his cell, Ferrandi finds a love story, reads it, and convinces himself he is in love as a way of feeling himself elsewhere. Perhaps she, in the course of that first encounter, gave Ferrandi her comb as a pledge of love. Now Ferrandi is kissing it, and as he kisses it, he is wrecked, oblivious, in the gulf whose waves the ivory prow had fended. Perhaps, who knows, even such a scoundrel could succumb to the memory of that face. Roberto now saw Ferrandi seated in the darkness at the mirror that reflected only the candle set before it. Contemplating two little flames, one aping the other, the eye stares, the mind is infatuated, visions rise. Shifting his head slightly, Ferrandi sees Lilia, her face of virgin wax, so bathed in light that it absorbs every other ray and causes her blonde hair to flow like a dark mass wound in a spindle behind her back, her bosom just visible beneath a delicate dress, its neck cut low. Then Ferrandi, at last. Roberto exulted, sought to gain too much from the vanity of a dream, and set himself, insatiable, before the mirror, and saw behind the reflected candle only the disfiguring black snout. An animal unable to bear the loss of an undeserved gift, he resumed touching her comb, but now, in the smoking of the candle end, that object, which for Roberto would have been the most adorable of relics, seemed to Ferrandi a toothy mouth ready to bite his dejection. Chapter 32. A Garden of Delights. At the idea of Ferrandi shut up on that island looking at a tweed Daphne he would never reach, separated from the lady, Roberto felt, and we must allow it, a reprehensible but comprehensible satisfaction, not unconnected with a certain satisfaction as narrator, since, with fine antimetabole, he had managed to seal up also his adversary in a siege spectacularly dissimilar to his own. You from that island of yours, with your leather mask, will never reach the ship. I, on the contrary, from my ship, with my mask of glass, am now on the verge of reaching my island. Thus he spoke, to himself, as he prepared to attempt once more his journey by water. He remembered the distance from the ship to the point where he had been wounded, and therefore he swam calmly at first, the mask at his belt. When he believed he was drawing close to the reef, he slipped on the mask and sank to explore the seabed. For a while he saw only patches, then, like a seaman on a ship in a foggy night, approaching a cliff, which suddenly looms, sheer, before his eyes, he saw the rim of the chasm over which he was swimming. He took off the mask, emptied it, replaced it, holding it with his hand, and with a slow kicking motion he headed for the spectacle he had just glimpsed. So this was coral. His first impression, to judge by his later notes, was confused, dazed. It was an impression of being in the shop of a merchant of stuffs who draped before his eyes sendals and taffetas, brocades, satins, damasks, velvets and bows, fringes and furbelows, and then stoles, pluvials, chasubles, dalmatics. But the stuffs moved with a life of their own, sensual as oriental dancing maids. In that landscape, which Roberto does not describe because, seeing it for the first time, he cannot find in his memory images capable of translating it into words, now suddenly a host of creatures erupted in these, indeed, he recognized, or at least could compare to others previously seen. They were fish, intersecting like shooting stars in an August sky, but in composing and distributing the hues and patterns of their scales, nature must have wanted to demonstrate the variety of accents that exists in the universe and how many can be placed together on a single surface. Some were striped in several colors, lengthwise or breadthwise, some had slanting lines and others had curving lines. Some seemed worked like intarsia with crumbs of spots brilliantly deployed, some were speckled or dotted, others patched, spattered, or minutely stippled, or veined like marble. Still others had a serpentine design, or a pattern like several interwoven chains. Some were spotted with enamels, sewn with shields and rosettes. And one, beautiful above the rest, seemed circled with cordons forming 2 rows of grapes and milk, and it was miraculous that not once did the row that enfolded the belly fail to continue on the flank, as if it were the work of an artist's hand. Only at that moment, seeing against the background of fish the coralline forms he had not been able to recognize at first, could Roberto make out bunches of bananas, baskets of bread rolls, corbeils of bronze loquats over which canaries and geckos and hummingbirds were hovering. He was above a garden. No, he was mistaken. Now it seemed a petrified forest, and at the next moment there were mounds, folds, shores, gaps and grottos, a single slope of living stones on which a vegetation not of this earth was composed in squat forms, or round, or scaly, that seemed to wear a granulated coat of mail, or else gnarled, or else coiled. But, different as they were all stupendous in their grace and loveliness, to such a degree that even those worked with feigned negligence, roughly shaped, displayed their roughness with majesty. They were monsters, true, but monsters of beauty. Or else, Roberto crosses out and revises, and is unable to report, like someone who must describe for the first time a squared circle, a coastal plain, a noisy silence, a nocturnal rainbow. What he was seeing were shrubs of cinnabar. Perhaps, holding his breath so long, he had grown befuddled, and the water entering his mask blurred shapes and hues. He thrust his head up to let air into his lungs, and resumed floating along the edge of the barrier, following its rifts and anfracts, past corridors of chalk in which Venus harlequins were stuck, while on a promontory he saw reposing, stirred by slow respiration and a waving of claws, a lobster crested with way over a coral net. This coral looked like the coral he knew, but was spread out like the legendary cheese of Fra Stefano, which never ends. What he saw now was not a fish, nor was it a leaf. Certainly it was a living thing, like two broad slices of whitish matter edged in crimson and with a feather fan. And where you would have expected eyes there were two horns of whipped sealing wax. Cypress polyps, which in their vermicular writhing revealed the rosy color of a great central lip, stroked plantations of albino phalli with amaranth landes, pink minnows dotted with olive-grazed ashen cauliflowers sprayed with scarlet, striped tubers of blackening copper. And then he could see the porous, saffron liver of a great animal, or else an artificial fire of mercury arabesques, wisps of thorns dripping sanguine, and finally a kind of chalice of flaccid mother of pearl. That chalice then looked to him like an urn, and he thought that among those rocks was inhumed Father Casper's corpse. No longer visible, if the action of the water had covered it with coralline cartilage, but the corals, absorbing the terrestrial humors of that body, had assumed shapes of flowers and garden fruits. Perhaps in a little while he would recognize the poor old man transformed into an alien creature down here. The globe of the head made from a hairy coconut, two withered apples for the cheeks, eyes and eyelids turned into two unripe apricots, the nose of sow thistle knotty like an animal's dung. Below, in place of lips, dried figs, a bead with its apiculate stalk for the chin, and a wrinkled cardoon functioning as the throat, and at both temples, two chestnut burrs to act as side curls, and for ears the halves of a split walnut. For fingers, carrots, a watermelon as belly, quinces, the knees. How could Roberto dress such funereal thoughts in such a grotesque form? No, in quite different form the remains of his poor friend would have proclaimed in this place their faithful et in Arcadia ego. There, perhaps in the form of that gravelly coral skull, that double of a stone that seemed already uprooted from its bed. Whether out of piety, in memory of his lost master, or to rob from the sea at least one of its treasures, he grasped it and, having seen too much for that day, clutched this booty to his bosom and returned to the ship. Chapter 33. Mundus Subterraneus. The coral had challenged Roberto. After discovering the extent of nature's capacity for invention, he felt bidden to a contest. Could he leave Ferrandi in that prison, leave his own story only half finished? Assuage his bitterness towards his rival and mortify his storyteller's pride? No, but what could he make happen to Ferrandi? The idea came to Roberto one morning when, as usual, he had placed himself in ambush, at dawn, to catch the orange dove unawares. Early in the morning the sun struck his eyes, and Roberto had even tried to construct around the larger lens of his spyglass a kind of shield, using a page from the ship's log, but at certain moments he was reduced to seeing only glints. When the sun finally did appear on the horizon, the sea mirrored it, doubling its every ray. But that morning, Roberto was convinced he had seen something rise from the trees towards the sun, then melt into its luminous sphere. Probably it was an illusion. Any bird in that light would have seemed to glitter. Roberto was convinced he had seen the dove, and yet was disappointed at having lied to himself. In this contradictory mood he felt once again defrauded. For a creature like Roberto, who by now had reached the point where he jealously enjoyed only what was stolen from him, it took little to dream that Ferrandi had been given what to him was denied. But since Roberto was the author of this story and unwilling to grant Ferrandi too much, he decided that the wretch would deal only with the other dove, the blue-green one. And this was because Roberto had decided, though without any certitude, that of the couple the orange must be the female, as if to say she. Since in the story of Ferrandi the dove was not to represent the conclusion but, rather, the agent of possession, for the present the male fell to him. Could a blue-green dove, which flies only over the South Seas, go and light on the sill of that window where Ferrandi was pining for his freedom? Yes, in the land of romances. And anyway, could not the Tweed Daphne have returned only recently from these seas, more fortunate than her older sister, bearing in the hold this bird, now set free? In any case, Ferrandi, ignorant of the Antipodes, could not ask himself such questions. He saw the dove, first fed it a few breadcrumbs merely to pass the time, then he wondered if it could not be used to further his own purposes. He knew that doves sometimes served to carry messages. Of course, entrusting a message to that animal did not mean it would necessarily reach its destination, but in this total ennui the effort was worth making. To whom could he appeal for help, he who out of enmity towards all, himself included, had made only enemies, and the few people who had served him were shameless, prepared to follow him only in good fortune and surely not in disaster? He said to himself, I will ask help of the lady, who loves me, but how can he be so sure? The envious Roberto wondered, after he invented that self-confidence. Biscarat had left him writing materials, in the possibility that the knight would bring counsel and persuade him to send a confession to the cardinal. So on one side of the paper Ferrante wrote the address of the lady, adding that whoever delivered the message would receive a reward. On the other side he wrote where he lay. He had heard a name spoken by his warders, victim of an infamous plot of the cardinal, and he begged to be rescued. Then he rolled up the paper and tied it to the leg of the bird, urging it to fly off. To tell the truth, he then forgot, or almost forgot, this action. How could he think that the azure dove would actually fly to Lilia? Such things happened only in fairy tales, and Ferrante was not a man to trust in tales. Probably the dove was shot by a hunter, to plunge among a tree's boughs, losing the message. Ferrante did not know that the bird instead was caught in the snare of a peasant, who thought to profit from what, judging by appearances, was a signal sent to someone, perhaps to the commander of an army. Now this peasant took the message to be examined by the one person in his village who knew how to read, namely, the curate, who then organized everything properly. Having identified the lady, he sent a friend to her to negotiate the delivery, deriving from it a generous offering for his church and a reward for the peasant. Lilia read, wept, sought out trusted friends for advice. Try to touch the cardinal's heart? Nothing easier for a beautiful woman of the court, but this woman frequented the salon of Arthenis, whom Mazarin distrusted. Satirical verses about the new minister were already circulating, and some said they came from those rooms. Aprecias who went to the cardinal to implore mercy for a friend would be sentencing that friend to sterner punishment. No, a band of brave men had to be assembled, who could be persuaded to mount a surprise attack. But to whom could she turn? Now Roberto was at a loss. If he had been, say, a musketeer of the king or a cadet of Gascony, Lilia could have appealed to those men, brave, renowned for their esprit de corps. But who would risk the wrath of a minister, perhaps of the king himself, for a foreigner who spent his time among librarians and astronomers? And as for librarians and astronomers, it was best to forget them. Though bent on continuing his novel, Roberto could not imagine the canon of Digne or Monsieur Gaffarel galloping full tilt towards his prison, or, rather, the prison of Ferrante, who at this point everyone thought to be Roberto. A few days later Roberto had an inspiration. He had set aside the story of Ferrante to continue his exploration of the coral reef. That day he was following a school of fish whose snouts bore a yellow visor, like swirling warriors. They were about to enter a cleft between two towers of stone where the corals were the crumbling palaces of a sunken city. Roberto imagined those fish were wandering amid the ruins of that city of wise he had heard of, which presumably still existed not many miles off the coast of Brittany, where the waves had engulfed it. There, the largest fish was the ancient king of the city, followed by his dignitaries, and all were riding out in search of their treasure swallowed up by the sea. But why recur to an ancient legend? Why not consider these fish the inhabitants of a world that has its forests, its peaks, its trees, and its valleys, and knows nothing of the world above the surface? Similarly, we live with no knowledge that the curved sky conceals other worlds, where people do not walk or swim but fly and navigate through the air. If what we call planets are the keels of their vessels, of which we see only the shining bottom, then these children of Neptune must see above them the shadow of our galleons and consider them heavenly bodies moving through their aqueous firmament. And if it is possible that creatures live underwater, could not creatures also live under the earth, nations of salamanders capable of arriving, through their tunnels, at the central fire that animates the planet? Reflecting in this way, Roberto remembered an argument of Saint Savins. We think it is difficult to live on the surface of the moon, believing there is no water there, but perhaps water up there exists in subterranean hollows, and nature has dug wells on the moon, which are the spots we see. How do we know that the inhabitants of the moon do not find refuge in those niches, to escape the intolerable proximity of the sun? Did not the first Christians live underground? And so the moon folk live always in catacombs, which to them seem homely. Nor is there any reason that they must live in the dark. Perhaps there are many holes in the crust of the satellite, and the interior is illuminated through thousands of slits. Theirs is a night traversed by brilliant shafts, not very different from the interior of a church or the lower deck of the Daphne. Or perhaps, instead, on the surface there are phosphorescent stones that during the day soak up the sunlight, then release it at night, and the Lunarians collect those stones at every sunset so that their tunnels are always more brilliant than any royal palace. Paris, Roberto thought. Is it not a known fact that, like Rome, the whole city is underlaid with catacombs, where it is said that at night malefactors and beggars take refuge? Beggars. Here was the idea for rescuing Ferrante. The beggars, who, as the story goes, are governed by their own king and by a code of iron laws. The beggars, a society of grim rabble living off thievery and misery, assassinations and extravagances, filth, villainy, and treachery, while they pretend to subsist on Christian charity. An idea that only a woman in love could conceive, Roberto told himself. For her confidences Lilia did not approach courtiers or gentlemen of the robe, but, rather, the least of her maid-servants, a woman engaged in unscrupulous traffickings with a wagoner who knew all the taverns around Notre Dame, where at sundown the beggars congregated after spending their day whining in doorways. This was the path to take. Now her guide conducts her, in the heart of the night, to the church of Saint Martin des Champs, lifts a stone of the floor in the choir, and leads her down into the catacombs of Paris, advancing by torchlight in search of the king of the beggars. And this is when Lilia, disguised as a gentleman, a supple androgyne who passes through tunnels, down steps, and along low passages, where in the darkness she can discern here and there, huddled amid rags and tatters, legless bodies and faces marked with warts, pimples, erysipelas, scabs, impettigos, boils, and cankers, all gaggling, with hand extended whether to ask for alms or to mime an invitation. With a chamberlain's mien, proceed, forward, our master is expecting you. And there the master was, in the center of a hall 1,000 leagues under the surface of the city, seated on a cask, surrounded by cutpurses, barrators, counterfeiters, and saltimbanques, a scum laureate in every abuse and corruption. What could the king of the beggars be like? Wrapped in a tattered cloak, his brow covered with tubercules, his nose gnawed by a tabes, his eyes of marble, one green and one black, a weasel's gaze, brow sloping downwards, a harelip revealing wolf's teeth sharp and protruding, kinky hair, sandy skin, hands with stubby fingers and curving nails. Having heard out the lady, he replied that he had at his service an army compared to which the army of the French king was a provincial garrison. And far less costly. If these people were recompensed in an acceptable manner, say, twice the amount they could collect begging in the same period of time, they would have themselves killed for so generous an employer. Lilia slipped a ruby ring from her finger, as is usual in such situations, asking with regal manner, "Is this enough?" "Enough," the king of the beggars said, fondling the jewel with his vulpine gaze. "Tell us where," and having learned where, he added, "My people do not use horses or carriages, but that place can be reached on barges, following the Seine." Roberto imagined Ferrandi at sunset on the tower of the little fort conversing with Captain Biscarat, who suddenly saw them coming. They appeared first on the dunes, then spread out over the open field. "Pilgrims for Santiago," Biscarat remarked with contempt, "and of the worst sort, or the most unhappy. They go seeking health when they have one foot in the grave." In fact, the pilgrims, in a very long file, were advancing closer and closer to the shore, and Ferrandi and Biscarat could discern a mass of blind men with extended hands, the maimed on their crutches, lepers bleared, obsessed, and scrofulous, a jumble of cripples mutilated, clad in rags. "I would not want them to come too close, or to ask for shelter for the night," Biscarat said. "They would bring only filth inside the walls." And he ordered a few musket shots fired in the air, to make it clear that this little castle was not a place of hospitality. But those shots seemed to act like a summons. As more rabble appeared in the distance, the leaders came nearer and nearer to the fortress, and already their animal mumbling could be heard. "Keep them off, by God!" Biscarat shouted, and he had some bread thrown down at the foot of the wall, as if to say to them that such was the charity of the place's master and they could expect nothing more. But the foul band, its ranks swelling visibly, drove its vanguard to the very walls, trampling that gift underfoot and staring upwards, as if seeking something better. Now they could be seen one by one, and they bore no resemblance to pilgrims, or to unhappy wretches asking relief for their ailments. Beyond doubt, Biscarat said, worried, they were ragtag adventurers. Or so it seemed at least for a while, as it was now dusk, and the field and the dunes had become only a grey teeming of giant rats. To arms, Biscarat cried, finally realizing that this was no pilgrimage, no alms begging, but an assault. And he ordered shots fired at those who had already reached the wall. But, as if it was indeed a pack of rodents, more came. Shoving the first, the fallen were trampled and used as a step for others pressing from behind, and now the first could be seen clinging with their nails to the clefts of that ancient fabric, digging their fingers into the cracks, setting their feet in the gaps, clutching the bars of the lowest windows, thrusting their sciatical limbs into the slits. Meanwhile another part of that crowd was swaying on the ground, heaving their shoulders against the portal. Biscarat ordered it barricaded on the inside, but the sturdiest planks of those doors were beginning to creak under the pressure of that bastard force. The guards continued firing, but the few attackers who fell were immediately trodden on by others of the horde. Now only a seething mass was visible, from which eels of rope rose, flung into the air, and it was clear that they were iron grapples, and already some of them were hooked to the battlements. And no sooner did a guard lean out a bit to unfasten those hooked irons than the first attackers, who had hoisted themselves up, struck him with spikes and clubs, or caught him in nooses and pulled him below, where he vanished into the press of those diabolical fiends, his death rattle drowned in their roar. In no time, anyone following events from the dunes would have been unable to see the fort, only a teeming of flies over a corpse, a swarm of bees on a stalk, a confraternity of hornets. Meanwhile, from below, the crash of the great door was heard as it gave way, then a tumult in the yard. Biscarat and his men rushed to the other end of the platform, no longer concerned with Ferrandi, who flattened in the arch of the door that gave onto the stairs, not very frightened, for he had a presentiment that these attackers were somehow friends. Which friends, at this point, had reached and passed the battlements. Prodigal with their lives, falling at the last rounds of musket fire, heedless of their exposed breasts, they passed the barrier of drawn swords and horrified the guards with their villainous eyes, their frenzied faces. Thus the cardinal's guards, otherwise men of iron, dropped their weapons, imploring mercy from heaven against what they now believed a band from hell, and the hellions first felled them with blows of their clubs, then flung themselves on the survivors, laying about, slapping, cuffing, smiting, thwacking, and they tore open throats with their bare teeth, quartered with their claws, they overwhelmed by spitting bile, they committed atrocities on the dead, and Ferrandi saw one cut open a man's chest, grab the heart, and devour it amid shrill cries. The last survivor was Biscarat, who had fought like a lion. Seeing himself finally defeated, he stood with his back to a parapet, drew a line on the ground with his bloody sword, and cried, "Ici mort Biscarat, seul de ceux qui sont avec lui." But at that instant a one-eyed man with a peg leg, brandishing an axe, emerged from the stairs, gave a signal, and put an end to the butchery, ordering Biscarat to be tied up. Then he saw Ferrandi, recognized him by the very mask that was to have made him unrecognizable, greeted him with a broad gesture of his armed hand, as if to sweep the ground with the plume of a hat, and said, "Sir, you are free." He drew a message from his jerkin, with a seal Ferrandi knew at once, and handed it to him. It was she who advised him to make free use of that army, horrid but trustworthy, and to await her there, as she would arrive at dawn. To begin with, Ferrandi, once freed from his mask, released the pirates and signed a pact with them. They would regain the ship and sail under his orders, asking no questions. Their recompense? A share of a treasure as vast as a dozen Eldorados. True to his character, Ferrandi had no thought of keeping his word. Once he found Roberto again, it would be enough to denounce his own crew at the first port of call, and he would have them all hanged, remaining master of the vessel. He no longer needed the beggars, and their leader, an honorable man, told him they had received payment for this undertaking. He wished to leave the area as soon as possible. They scattered inland and returned to Paris, begging from village to village. It was easy to board a shallop kept in the basin of the fort, reach the ship, and fling into the sea the two men who guarded it. Biscarat was chained in the hold, since he was a hostage who could be bartered advantageously. Ferrandi granted himself a brief rest, returned ashore before dawn, in time to welcome a carriage from which Lilia stepped, more beautiful than ever in her male garb. Roberto felt that he would suffer greater torment at the thought of the two greeting each other with reserve, not giving themselves away before the pirates, who believed their passenger to be a young gentleman. They boarded ship. Ferrandi made sure everything was ready to sail and, as the anchor was weighed, he went down to the chamber he had ordered to be made ready for his guest. Here she awaited him with eyes that asked for nothing save to be loved. In the fluent exultation of her hair, now released over her shoulders, she was ready for the most joyous of sacrifices. O errant locks, locks gilded and beloved, locks unlocked that fly and play and, in playing, ere, Roberto rhapsodized on Ferrandi's behalf. Their faces were close, to reap a harvest of kisses from a past sown with sighs, and at that moment Roberto drank, in thought, at that lip of fleshy pink. Ferrandi kissed Lilia, and Roberto imagined himself in that act and in the thrill of biting that true coral. But then he felt she was eluding him like a gust of wind. He lost the warmth he thought he had felt for an instant, and he saw her, icy, in a mirror, in other arms, on a distant bridal bed on another ship. To protect the lovers he lowered a curtain of jealous transparence, for those bodies, now bared, were books of solar necromancy, whose holy accents were revealed only to the two elect, who uttered them in turn from mouth to mouth. The ship sailed away swiftly, Ferrandi its master. In him she loved Roberto, into whose heart these images fell like sparks on a bundle of dry twigs. Chapter 34. Monologue on the Plurality of Worlds. We will remember, I hope, for Roberto has borrowed from the novelists of his century the habit of narrating so many stories at once that at a certain point it becomes difficult to pick up the thread. That from his first visit to the world of Coral our hero brought back the stone double, which seemed to him a skull, perhaps Father Casper's. Now, to forget the loves of Lilia and Ferrandi, he was seated on deck at sunset, contemplating that object, examining its form. It did not seem a skull. It was, rather, a mineral hive composed of irregular polygons, but the polygon was not the elementary unit of that object. Each polygon revealed in its center a spoke symmetry of very fine threads, among which appeared, if you sharpened your eyes, cavities that perhaps formed other polygons and, if the eye could penetrate still further, it would perhaps see that the faces of those tiny polygons were made of other, still tinier, polygons, until, dividing the parts into parts of parts, the point came when they would end, having arrived at those parts not further divisible, which are the atoms. But since Roberto did not know to what degree matter could be divided, it was not clear to him how far his eyes, alas, not lynx-like, since he did not possess that lens through which Casper had been able to identify even the animalcules of the plague, could descend into the abyss, finding new forms within the forms he perceived. Even the head of the Abbé, as Saint Savin had shouted that night during the duel, could be a whole world for his lice, and, Roberto, hearing the words again, thought of the world inhabited by those happiest of insects, the lice of Anna Maria, or Francesca, Novarese. But since lice are not atoms either but vast universes for the atoms that compose them, perhaps inside the body of the louse there are other animals still tinier who live there as in a spacious world. And perhaps my very flesh, Roberto thought, and my blood are no more than wefts of minuscule animals that, in moving, lend me movement, allowing themselves to be conducted by my will, which serves them as coachman. And my animals are surely wondering where I am taking them now, subjecting them to an alternation of marine coolness and solar ardor, and, confounded by this turmoil of unstable climes, they are as uncertain of their destiny as I am of mine. And what if even more minuscule animals found themselves in an equally unlimited space? What stops me from thinking this? Only the fact that I have never learned anything about it? As my friends in Paris used to say to me, someone on the Tower of Notre Dame, looking down from that height at the Faubourg Saint-Denis, could never think that ill-defined spot was inhabited by beings similar to us. We see the planet Jove, which is very big, but from Jove they do not see us, and they cannot even conceive of our existence. And even yesterday, would I have suspected that beneath the sea, not on a remote planet or in a drop of water, but in a part of our own world, another world existed? And for that matter, until a few months ago, what did I know of the austral land? I would have said it was the fancy of heretic geographers, and perhaps, who knows, in these islands, in times past, they burned some of their own philosophers for asserting in guttural grunts the existence of Monferrato and of France. And yet now I am here, and I must perforce believe that the Antipodes exist, and that, contrary to the opinion once held by very wise men, I am not walking with my feet up and my head down. Simply, the inhabitants of this world occupy the stern of the vessel, and we occupy the prow, and, each knowing nothing of the other, we are both sailing. The art of flying is still unknown, and yet, if we can believe one Mr. Goodwin, of whom M. Digby told me, one day we will go to the moon as we have gone to America, even if before Columbus no one suspected that the continent existed, nor that one day it would be given that name. Sunset gave way to evening, and evening to night. The moon was now full, and Roberto, seeing it in the sky, could make out its spots, which children and ignoramuses consider the eyes and mouth of a benevolent face. To provoke Father Casper, in what world, on what planet of the righteous was the dear old man now? Roberto had once spoken to him about the inhabitants of the moon. But can the moon really be inhabited? Why not? It was as Saint Denis said, what do the humans of this world know of what is up there? Roberto reasoned. If, standing on the moon, I fling a stone high, will it perhaps fall on the earth? No, it will fall on the moon. So the moon, like any other planet or star, as may be, is a world that has a center of its own, and a circumference, and this center attracts all the bodies that live within the sphere of that world's dominion. As on the earth, then why can all the other things that happen on earth not happen also on the moon? There is an atmosphere that enfolds the moon. On the Palm Sunday of 40 years ago did not someone see, as I have been told, clouds on the moon? On that planet, in the imminence of an eclipse, is it not possible to see a great trepidation? And what is this if not proof that there is air? The planets evaporate, and so do the stars. What else are the spots that are said to be on the sun, which generate the shooting stars? And on the moon there is surely water. How explain otherwise her spots than that they are the image of lakes? In fact, someone has suggested that these lakes are artificial, like human works, so neatly defined are they and arranged at regular distances. Moreover, if the moon had been conceived as a great mirror serving to reflect the sun's light onto the earth, why would the Creator have blemished that mirror with spots? Therefore the spots are not imperfections but perfections, and hence ponds, or lakes, or seas. And up there, if water exists, and air, then so does life. A life perhaps different from ours. Perhaps that water has the flavor of, let us say, glycyrrhizin, or cardamom, or even of pepper. If there are infinite worlds, this proves the infinite ingenuity of the engineer of our universe, but then there is no limit to this poet. He can have created inhabited worlds everywhere, but inhabited by ever different creatures. Perhaps the inhabitants of the sun are sunnier, brighter, and more illuminated than are the inhabitants of the earth, who are heavy with matter, and the inhabitants of the moon lie somewhere in between. On the sun live beings who are all form, or all act, if you prefer, while on the earth beings are made of mere potentials that evolve, and on the moon they are in medio fluctuants, lunatics, so to speak. Could we live in the moon's air? Perhaps not, it might make us dizzy. For that matter, fish cannot live in ours, nor can birds in the air of fish. The air of the moon must be purer than ours, but like ours, thanks to its density, it serves as a natural lens that filters the sun's rays, though the Selenites see the sun quite differently. Dawn and twilight, which illuminate us when the sun has not yet come or has just left, are a gift of our air which, rich in impurities, captures and transmits its light. This is light lavished on us to excess. Yet those rays prepare us for the acquisition and the loss of the sun little by little. Perhaps on the moon, since the air is finer, their days and nights arrive all of a sudden. The sun rises abruptly on the horizon like the parting of a curtain. Then, from the most dazzling light, all plunges at once into the most bituminous darkness. And the moon would lack the rainbow, an effect of vapors mixed with air. But perhaps for the same reason they have neither rain nor thunder and lightning. And the inhabitants of the planets closer to the sun, what can they be like? Fiery as Moors, but much more spiritual than we. How big will the sun be for them? How do they tolerate its light? Up there, do metals melt in nature and flow like rivers? But are there really infinite worlds? A question of this sort provoked a duel in Paris. The canon of Digne said he did not know the answer. Or, rather, the study of physics would lead him to say yes, in accord with the great Epicurus. The world can only be infinite. Atoms crowd into the void. That bodies exist is borne out by sensation. That the void exists is borne out by reason. How and where could the atoms move otherwise? If there were no void, there would be no motion, unless bodies penetrate one another. It would be ridiculous to think that when a fly presses a particle of air with its wing, that particle shifts another below it, and that yet another, so that the scratching of a flea's leg, from movement to movement, would finally produce a lump at the far end of the world. On the other hand, if the void were infinite and the number of atoms finite, they would never cease moving on all sides, they would never jostle one another, as two people would never meet, if not through inconceivable coincidence, wandering through an endless desert, and so they would not produce their composites. And if the void were finite and bodies infinite, there would not be room to contain them. Naturally, it would suffice to imagine a void inhabited by atoms in a finite number. The canon told me this is the more prudent opinion. Why obligate God like some theatrical manager to produce infinite performances? He manifests his freedom eternally through the creation and maintenance of a single world. There are no arguments against the plurality of worlds, but there are also none in its favor. God, who was before the world, has created a sufficient number of atoms in a space sufficiently wide to compose his masterpiece. A part of his infinite perfection is also the genius of limitation. To see if and how many worlds there were in a dead thing, Roberto went into the little museum on the Daphne, and he lined up on the bridge, as if he had before him so many astragals, all the dead objects he found there. Fossils, pebbles, fish bones. He shifted his eyes from one to the other, continuing to reflect on chance and chances. But how do I know, he asked himself, that God tends to limitation, when my experience constantly reveals to me other, new worlds, whether up above or down below? It could then be that not God but the world is eternal and infinite and has always been so and ever shall be, in an infinite recomposition of its infinite atoms in an infinite void, according to laws I do not know yet, through unpredictable but regulated shifts of the atoms, which otherwise would move wildly. And then the world would be God. God would be born of eternity as universe without shores, and I would be subject to its law, without knowing what that law was. Fool, some say. You can speak of the infinity of God because you are not called upon to conceive it with your mind, but only to believe in it as one believes in a mystery. But if you want to speak of natural philosophy, you must also conceive this infinite world, and you cannot. Perhaps. But let us think, then, that the world is both full and finite. And let us try to conceive the nothingness that comes after the world has ended. When we think of that nothingness, can we perhaps picture it as a wind? No, because it would have to be truly nothing, not even wind. In terms of natural philosophy, not of faith, is an interminable nothing conceivable? It is much easier to imagine horned men or two-tailed fish through composition of parts already known. We can only add to the world, where we believe it ends, more parts similar to those we already know, an expanse made again and always of water and land, stars and skies. Without limit. But if the world were finite, nothingness, inasmuch as it is nothing, could not be, and what then would lie beyond the confines of the world? The void. And so, to deny the infinite we affirm the void, which can only be infinite, otherwise at its end we would have to think again of a new and inconceivable expanse of nothing. Thus it is better to think at once and freely of the void and people it with atoms, reserving the right to think of it as empty, emptier than any emptiness. Roberto discovered he was enjoying a great privilege, which gave a meaning to his defeat. Here he was holding the clear proof of the existence of other skies, but at the same time without having to ascend beyond the celestial spheres, for he intuited many worlds in a piece of coral. Was there any need to calculate the number of forms which the atoms of the universe could create, burning at the stake all those who said their number was not finite, when it sufficed to meditate for years on one of these marine objects to realize how the deviation of a single atom, whether willed by God or prompted by chance, could generate inconceivable Milky Ways? The redemption? A false argument, indeed, Roberto protested, to avoid trouble with the next Jesuit he might meet, the argument of those who cannot conceive the Lord's omnipotence. Who can deny the possibility that in the great plan of creation, original sin was realized at the same time on all worlds, in different and unheard of ways yet all equally, so that Christ died on the cross for all, including the Selenites and the Syrians and the Corallines who lived on the molecules of this tunneled rock when it was still living? To tell the truth, Roberto was not entirely convinced by his own arguments. He was composing a dish that had too many ingredients, or rather, he was cramming into a single argument things heard in various places, and he was not so ingenious that he did not realize as much. So, having defeated one possible adversary, he restored speech to him and identified himself with the opponent's rebuttal. Once, in speaking of the void, Father Casper had silenced him with a syllogism which Roberto could not answer. The void is not being, but not being cannot be, ergo the void cannot be. The reasoning was sound, because it denied the void while granting that it could be conceived. In fact, we can quite easily conceive things that do not exist. Can a chimera, buzzing in the void, devour second intentions? No, because chimeras do not exist, in the void no buzzing can be heard, and intentions are mental things. An intended pair does not nourish us. And yet I can think of a chimera even if it is chimerical, namely, if it is not. And the same with the void. Roberto recalled the reply of a 19-year-old youth who one day in Paris had been invited to a gathering of his philosopher friends because he was said to be designing a machine capable of arithmetical calculations. Roberto had not clearly understood how the machine was supposed to work, and he had considered the boy, perhaps out of acrimony, too wan, too sad, and too pedantic for his age, whereas Roberto's libertine friends were teaching him that you could be learned in a playful fashion. And Roberto had tolerated it still less when, as they were discussing the void, The boy insisted on speaking, even with a certain impudence. There has been too much talk of the void. Now it must be demonstrated through experiment. And he said this as if that task would one day fall to him. Roberto asked what experiment he had in mind, and the boy replied that he did not yet know. To embarrass him, Roberto listed all the philosophical objections he could think of. If the void existed, it would not be matter, which is full, nor would it be spirit, for we cannot conceive a spirit that is void, nor would it be God, because it would lack even itself, it would be neither substance nor accident, it would shed its light without being hylan. What, then, would it be? The boy replied with humble boldness, his eyes lowered. Perhaps it would be something halfway between matter and nothingness, and would partake of neither. It would differ from nothingness because of its dimension, and from matter because of its immobility. It would be almost a not being. Not supposition, not abstraction. It would be, how shall I say it, a fact. Pure and simple. What is a fact pure and simple, lacking any determination? Roberto asked with scholastic arrogance. Though he had no opinions on the subject, he, too, wanted to talk pedantically. I am unable to define what is pure and simple, the youth answered. For that matter, sir, how can you define being? To define it, it would be necessary to say that it is something. Thus to define being you would first have to say is and therefore use in the definition the term being defined. I believe there are terms impossible to define, and perhaps the void is one of them. But I may be mistaken. You are not mistaken. The void is like time, one of Roberto's libertine friends commented. Time is not the quantity of movement, because movement depends on time and not vice versa. It is infinite, increate, continuous, it is not an accident of space. Time is, and that is that. And the void is, and that is also that. Some protested, saying a thing that is and that is that, without having a definable essence, might just as well not be. Gentlemen, the canon of Digne then said, it is true, space and time are neither body nor spirit, they are immaterial, if you like, but this does not mean they are not real. They are not accident and they are not substance, and yet they came before creation, before any substance and any accident, and they will exist also after the destruction of every substance. They are immutable and invariable, whatever you may put inside them. But, Roberto objected, space also extends, and extension is a property of bodies. No, the libertine friend rebutted, the fact that all bodies extend does not mean that everything extended is a body. As a certain gentleman would have it, who moreover would not deign to reply to me, because it seems he no longer wants to return from Holland. Extension is the disposition of all that is. Space is absolute extension, eternal, infinite, increate, illimitable, uncircumscribed. Like time, it has no end, is inaccessible, impossible to disperse, it is an Arabian phoenix, a serpent biting its tail. Sir, the canon said, let us not put space in God's stead. Sir, the libertine replied, you cannot present to us ideas that all of us consider true, then demand that we not draw from them the ultimate consequences. I suspect that at this point we no longer need God or his infinity, because we already have enough infinities on all sides reducing us to a shadow that lasts only an instant without return. So, then, I propose banishing all fear, and going, in a body, to the tavern. Shaking his head, the canon took his leave, and so did the youth, who seemed quite troubled by this talk. Head bowed, he excused himself and said he had to return to his house. Poor boy, the libertine then said, he builds machines to count the finite, and we have terrified him with the eternal silence of too many infinities. Voila, the end of a fine vocation. He will not recover from the blow, another of the Pyrrhonians said.